reason that I wrote this book was because I worked as a legal counselor for abused women for many years in South Africa. And after I decided to leave this work because it was so traumatic, I immigrated to Australia. And many years later, I discovered a letter amongst my possessions written by a woman that I had helped many years earlier, thanking me for what I had done for her. And suddenly it was like all these memories that I had pressed down and put away emerged again. And I began to hear all these voices, all these stories of all these women that I had helped. And I ran to my computer and I just wrote down the first lines of my book. And then it was like a waterfall was unleashed inside of me, and one story after another that I had repressed and forgotten just came up again. So I often think that I didn't choose to write this book, but this book chose me and reminded me that I had to tell the stories of all those women that I had counseled all those years ago. Now, that was the reality that I experienced while I was a counselor for abused women. It felt to me like there was just so much abuse and trauma all around me. You know, when you're so immersed in that world, you start to get a warped sense of reality. You start to imagine that all men are abusers, all women are victims. And it's so important to be able to remember that it's such a small slice of humanity when you're working in this work. It's not the full picture of humanity. It's not the full spectrum of humanity. My involvement in violence against women happened soon after I returned from America. I did a master's degree in law at Yale, and I came back to South Africa, and I saw that violence against women was such a big problem, and I really wanted to do something to help. So I became an expert, so-called expert in this field. I educated a lot of people around how to use legal remedies in dealing with violence against women. And I then set up a legal advocacy center to end violence against women. I sat on a law commission and drafted domestic violence legislation, and did a lot of media work as well, and educated police officers, magistrates, lawyers about how to deal with issues of gender violence. Well, when you are deeply involved in this work, it is very difficult not to feel deeply affected by the stories that you see. There are some stories and cases that I've seen that I wouldn't even want to repeat the facts of them. I wouldn't want anybody to have those images in their minds. It took me a long time to be able to deal with a lot of the trauma. You know, people who work with trauma suffer from what's called secondary traumatization. You become traumatized from witnessing so much trauma. And so you really do need to have very good boundaries. You also need to not take things personally. You need to be able to understand that sometimes you cannot help people even when you have, you've done a lot of work to support them. Domestic violence, there is this phenomenon where women find it very difficult to actually leave their situations. And sometimes when you feel very invested in it, you might take it personally when a woman isn't able to leave and goes back. And then even worse, if something happens to her, you have to be able to not feel guilty if something happens to her. So it's very difficult work, and there is a lot of trauma that people who work with traumatized people feel. And so it's so important to have a good regime of self-care if you are doing that work. Well, I wrote this book because I wanted to leave a hopeful message. Faith herself is not a victim of any form of violence. She is just a witness to a lot of violence, and she decides that she no longer wants to be that kind of witness because she wants to live a life where she is in the outdoors, where she can see the beauty in the world, not just the trauma and the darkness in the world. And I always believe that we have a choice about how we want to live our lives and the things that we want to focus on. So the message that I wanted people to get from reading my book was that it is always possible to make another choice and to, even when you have given up on love, to find love. It could be right in front of you at any time. I named everybody in my book after a real person who died in some form of violent attack, because I wanted people to understand that even though this is a novel, that the violence that happens in society is real, that real people have died. And it was my way of honoring people who have died in gender violence. I wanted their names to live on in my book, and I wanted people at the end to get a real shock to understand that, in fact, all these characters and the names that they had come to know in the reading of the book were named after real people. Even though it's a story, violence in society is real. Abuse happens in every society, at every level of education, economic level, in every religious group, in every social group. It happens everywhere. And I really wanted people to understand that it was not restricted. Domestic violence and rape and abuse is not a phenomenon that happens in poor countries or poor societies. It happens everywhere. It's pervasive. I no longer work in this area. I've been a full-time author for the past 12 years. I actually now support other people to write their stories. And what is amazing, because I mostly work with women, is that stories of abuse abound. No matter where I am, no matter who I'm speaking to, there are always these stories that are tucked away inside women's lives, stories of sexual abuse, incest, rape, domestic violence. They happen everywhere. So, and I am still working with a lot of writers who are dealing with some of these very difficult stories, but no longer counseling people to actually get out of those difficult relationships. I used to find that a huge responsibility. Now I'm really helping people heal by raising their voices and telling their stories of survival.